Hi there, welcome to GCH. I'm Jill Blakeway, and we have a slightly different show for you this week. Normally, we grow and cook and heal, as you know, but for this episode only, we're going to focus on healing the planet. I'll be talking to Dr. Stephen Greer. He believes that since the early 1900s, there have been advances in energy technology that, if they were taken seriously, could free us from fossil fuels and provide the world with limitless, free and clean energy. I'll be giving him the opportunity to elaborate on that on today's show. As always, you'll find links and extra information at jillblakeway.com. And here it is, episode 13 of Grow, Cook, Heal.
It's GCH with Jill Blakeway, sharing her thoughts on her journey to grow.
So come with me. I'm going to go down to the garden to see my husband Noah, who's been down there all day doing the thing I like least, which is why I haven't been down there with him, which is all the cleanup at the end of the season.
Cook.
I invite him on the show because he is a genius at getting small children to eat healthy food. And I wanted you to show us how it's done.
And heal.
And I think that the probiotics in sauerkraut are different, aren't they, to the probiotics in yogurt?
It's GCH, a CBS radio production.
It's like the circle of life around here.
And now, Jill Blakeway.
Hi, you guys. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Heal. We're having a temporary change in format this week because I want to take a little time for a slightly more in-depth interview with a man called Dr. Stephen Greer. Who is Dr. Greer? Well, many of you may have heard of him. He's a former medical doctor. He was actually the head of emergency medicine at a hospital in North Carolina. But as he points out in this interview, his uncle was one of the designers of the lunar module, and so his interest in space technology started young. That led him into the world of extraterrestrial life, which eventually led him to found the Disclosure Project. Now, GCH listeners, you could write what I know about extraterrestrial life on the back of a postage stamp. I've never met an alien, and I've never seen a UFO. But, you know, it's a vast universe, and in all probability there's life out there somewhere. But it's a subject that becomes trivial and silly really quickly, which is why I asked Dr. Greer on the show. He's far from crazy. He's actually a very scientifically literate and credible man who's spent the last 20 years steeped in this area. If you've never seen the video of the Disclosure Project press conference, I suggest you search for it on YouTube. Back in 2001, Dr. Greer gathered together experts from the military, NASA, major corporations, along with flight controllers and pilots, all of whom showed up at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. to bear witness to a cover-up at the highest levels of government. If nothing else, it was fascinating viewing. The purpose of this cover-up, according to Dr. Greer, is to maintain the status quo. He contends that since the days of Nikola Tesla back in the late 1900s, we've had access to clean, free and abundant energy that would free us all from fossil fuels, end the geopolitical maneuvers that are motivated by our dependence on oil, and lead much of the world out of poverty. Dr. Greer will tell you that this is the cover-up Eisenhower was referring to when he used the phrase the military-industrial complex in his farewell speech as president back in 1961, and that President Kennedy referred to as a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. Everyone has to make up their own minds about this kind of stuff, but this is an interesting interview, and Dr. Greer is a fascinating man. And when you've listened to it, I think you'll understand why I decided to break with our usual format in order to air it. But it's a controversial area, and I'm open and really interested to hear your views. You can contact me on Facebook, where I'm Jill Blakeway, or through my website, jillblakeway.com. But before we get on with the rest of our show, I do want to say thank you to our sponsors, Lisa, who are a mattress company. There is no smooth way, GCH listeners, to transition from international conspiracies to mattresses, but I will tell you this. Lisa donate a free mattress to a homeless shelter for every 10 mattresses they sell, and for every single mattress they sell, they plant a tree. So for a show that's all about healing ourselves and the planet, their endorsement is very much appreciated. Their mattresses are 100% American-made, super comfy and affordable, and what's more, Lisa want to offer you, the GCH listeners, a discount. So if you're in the market for a mattress, just go to www.lisa.com/grow. That's www.lisa, spelled LEESA.com/grow, and you'll get $75 off your purchase. Thank you, Lisa. And now, let's hear what Dr. Greer has to say, shall we? I have on the line today Dr. Stephen Greer. Dr. Greer is a medical doctor. He was the chairman of the Department of Emergency Medicine at Colby Memorial Hospital in North Carolina, but he spent a good part of his career challenging the accepted norms when it comes to the information that people all over the world are given by their governments. He's written 4 books. He teaches widely. He's the founder of the Disclosure Project, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the Orion Project. He was the subject of a very interesting documentary recently called Sirius. Dr. Stephen Greer, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be with you.
I'm very happy to have you on the show. We obviously could talk about a lot. You've had a very varied career, but I invited you on the show today to talk about the work you do with the Orion Project, which you founded to campaign for alternative energy. And it's your position, isn't it, Dr. Greer, that since the early 1900s, there have been advances in energy generation that could free us from fossil fuels and provide the world with limitless, free and clean energy.
Right, and of course, a lot of people wonder if it's an urban myth, and of course it isn't. And a little bit of my background, my uncle designed the lunar module that put the first man on the moon back in 1969.
Wow.
And so I come from an aerospace family. And although I'm a medical doctor, I took an interest in a lot of these areas when I was quite young. And if you begin to mush around a little bit within the very highly classified world of technology, aerospace science, and things of this sort, you come across some things that would appear to most people to be science fiction, except it's science fact. And so I began to look into this, formed an organization in 1990 to study this further. And by the early 1990s, I was providing briefings to President Clinton's CIA director and a number of other folks about these projects because they are managed in a way that is so tightly held and compartmentalized in the intelligence community and in the contracting community that the president, frankly, was being deceived on it. And so began the Disclosure Project, and from there the Orion Project. And the Orion Project is really focusing on what technologies are in these classified projects that would benefit the Earth and humanity, and really why are they being kept classified improperly. And I think the average person doesn't realize that very mainstream organization, the Federation of American Scientists, back in 2010, issued a report from their National Security Project that there were over 5,000 patents that had been illegally seized by the Patent Office under the cover of a national security order, meaning that the technology was of value to the national security. So, what many people think, well, this is some type of, a conspiracy theory or something. It isn't. There are just amazing technologies that would replace carbon-based fuels, but also wind and solar power that would be much more efficient and much more cost-effective that we have already developed but are being kept away from the public. And I was so outraged by this that I left medicine to try to fix this problem some years ago.
I'm aware that that's what you did, and I actually want to talk a little bit more about how it gets suppressed in a moment. I'd like the listeners, the GCH listeners, and myself actually, to understand what exactly we're talking about, because we're not talking about the kind of alternative energy that we talk about when we talk about renewable clean energy sources like wind and solar and hydrogen.
Oh, no, well, that's all rubbish, isn't it? I mean, I have the largest solar farm in Virginia here, but it's so inefficient and so expensive. I'm talking about very high tech. And one thing I want to remind your listeners of, Peter Thiel, who co-founded PayPal with Elon Musk, said, look, that we don't have a high-tech society. It still takes us the same amount of time to go from JFK to Paris on a jet as it did in 1964. I'd like for people to take a step back and think about the fact that our entire civilization is running on a paradigm of physics which is locked in pretty much the late 1800s, whether it be your iPhone with electromagnetic signals or your car running gasoline or a jet spewing out and using jet fuel. That's, of course, the same as oil that's been modified for jet fuel. There's very little difference. And what I'm talking about are technologies that are in the domain of high-energy physics. But if you can visualize that at the baseline of space and time is an energy field, it's been called a zero-point energy field. It was proven decades ago by Professor Casimir. And in this zero-point energy field, there's enough energy in every cubic centimeter of space. The density is so great that you could run all of the United States for at least a year on it. And this is the field of energy I'm talking about. And there have been incredible breakthroughs all the way back to the time of Faraday and Nikola Tesla and others, where they have been able to figure out the electromagnetic signal that you need to put into a substance, say a crystalline substance or even water, to pull that energy out. And this is not again, something that's mythological. There are reports in the physics journals and what have you. The problem is every time someone has a breakthrough in something that could be commercially viable, the corrupt interests within the national security state circle their wagons and pretty much hoover up, classify those sort of developments, mainly because it would terminate the oil, gas, coal, public utilities, et cetera, industries. And this has become a huge problem that is not being addressed by any of the politicians and is sort of just hush-hush. And so I think that the listener, your audience, needs to understand that the science for this is positive. It's already been very well established. This is not a theoretical field of physics. The only question is, has it been developed to the point of commercial viability? And the answer to that is yes, but it runs into the buzzsaw of this suppression. So if you can visualize, let's say those of you who have like a heat pump for your house, instead of a motor in there that's doing an air exchange for heating and cooling your house, it would be an electronic system that would tap into this zero-point energy field that would then provide you with all the energy you need to run your house, or for that matter, the same thing could be under the hood of your car to charge an electric engine, so you did not have to plug the car in. This is what Tesla Motors really needs to be developing, but I'm quite sure they're afraid to touch it. That's the area of science and technology I'm talking about. Now, of course, obviously, the implications of this are enormous.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about what the world would be like if people had access to this kind of free energy, how it would change the world geopolitically.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to at least give people a 1 nanosecond overview of what the technology is. So if you can get your mind around what I just shared, and by the way, if you go to our website, SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS disclosure, all one word.com, there's this area on new energy you can go to that's quite amazing for the papers and research that's there, and it's quite extensive under the Orion Project and in other areas. And the world would be completely transformed because not only would you have no more pollution, but within about 20 years there'd be no poverty on the planet as we see it today. Now, also, there would be no centralized energy grid system. So, we're spending $1 trillion trying to update this cranky old electric utility grid. They're calling it the smart grid. I call it the new dumb grid. And unfortunately, what the truth is that we don't need a grid at all because every single home and business and anything that uses energy could have its own power plant in it.
So why are we doing it, Stephen? Why is the government building all this? Why are we maintaining the status quo if we have access to all this free energy?
Well, the left hand doesn't know the right hand exists. Now, this is what I was talking about a moment ago. I mean, you have highly compartmented projects. A lot of people have this very sort of high school idea of the government and how it works. So there's the government of we the people that are elected and appointed officials, et cetera, and so on, which basically they don't know anything about anything very important. I'll be quite frank with you. The programs that are highly classified, so-called unacknowledged special access projects, USAPs, these projects deal with this area, and ordinarily if a general or a senator on the Senate Intelligence Committee, like folks I've met with, or a CIA director makes an inquiry into this, they're either lied to or flat out told they don't have a need to know. And this gets into another question of how much this kind of secrecy has eroded our constitutional republic and democracy, and not only here, but in Great Britain and other countries. And it's something that President Eisenhower warned about when he said, beware the military-industrial complex, because it will overcome and overtake our democracy and be a threat to our democracy from extreme secrecy, this kind of excessive secrecy. And I think that's what the public has to understand. Is that the problems we're facing, which seem to be so intractable, aren't intractable. In fact, they're quite solvable. But you have these special interests who have enormous clout and power within classified programs who want to see the status quo continue. They do not want to upset the petrodollar system, and they do not want to upset, the big behemoths of industry like ExxonMobil or BP or any of the rest of them. But at a certain point, the public needs to learn about this and say, look, we want some real solutions to these problems, not the pseudo-solutions of a windmill or a solar panel. And I think that's really what we need to begin to engage in a dialogue on.
Well, I wanted to read, actually, for the GCH listeners, a quote from President Kennedy, which I know that you're very familiar with, but I think people perhaps aren't as familiar with, which is this: "For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It's a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations." President Kennedy was basically talking about the same thing that you're talking about, isn't it? That's what we're up against.
Right, and of course the revisionists have said, oh, he was only talking about the Soviet Union, which is nonsense, because he was actually talking about the same thing Eisenhower had spoken about. And Eisenhower, when he made that comment, of course people forget Eisenhower was a five-star general and Republican. And when he left office, the day he left office, he gave that famous speech. Very few people knew why. Now, we have since discovered that in the 1950s, there were enormous breakthroughs with this kind of technology that included what has been erroneously called UFOs. In other words, things that zip around in the sky at enormous velocities. And this has to do with the mass cancellation or so-called anti-gravity effect of these other technologies that can give you propulsion without jet engines or propeller wings. That's quite astonishing. And these developments were all in place in the 1950s. But what I'm saying is that we haven't needed surface roads or jet engine or aircraft since 1954.
So who are these people?
This was something that Eisenhower ran up against this. And he ran into the military-industrial and covert interests who did not want to upset the status quo, and it has gone out. It's gone further and further out of control ever since then. And to my knowledge, there has been no president who's really been able to get it under control.
Are they aware that it's a problem? Even do they struggle?
They do. I mean, like when Obama became president, I did a very extensive briefing for him that was provided via John Podesta, who, as you know, is Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, but at the time was the man who put together the Obama cabinet. And so this is certainly known, but, you know, people conflate knowing about something to having control over it, and this is a very wrong association. There are people who know about this problem, but they seem to have no authority to deal with it. In fact, when Jimmy Carter was once asked about this, he says, yes, I mean, someone asked, you know, about him being the most powerful man in the world, and he said, I don't think I was that man, because there were things that I wanted to know about that I was not given access to or any control over. And someone at the dinner party laughed jokingly in a ridiculing way, said, oh, you mean things like UFOs? And President Carter said, yes, that and more. And so he was referring to this area of technology. And I think this is something that, because the media, with the help of the intelligence community, has made jokes of this subject and ridiculed it so soundly, most serious people don't look at this in a way that is critical, and they sort of dismiss as nonsense. But when you begin to dig into the evidence is quite overwhelming and quite astonishing. And that's what we did with the Disclosure Project, was to put together over 100 top-secret military and intelligence and corporate witnesses to these events and projects, and government documents and other evidence. And so this is something we began to put out in the 90s and early 2000s, and which we continue to work on. And most people don't realize that at the core of the secrecy, although this isn't the sole reason for it, is sort of a macroeconomic hegemony, a tendency to want to maintain the status quo of the macroeconomic system, at the core of which is our industrial base, which is run almost entirely on fossil fuels, which are destroying the planet. So if you want to really address a solution for this, you're not going to be able to do it without beginning to deal with some things that make people rather uncomfortable, But, we have to deal with the realities as they are.
I understand. I want to talk a little bit. You talked about ridicule being one of the ways this is covered up, and I'm aware of that. That becomes about UFOs and aliens, and it's very easy to ridicule very quickly. You are an amazing advocate for this because you are so credible and you are so scientific, and that's why I wanted to talk to you, actually. But I want to talk about the other ways that it's covered up, because this technology gets covered up, doesn't it, by sometimes it's bought by a front company and then shelved. Isn't that called black shelving, where they buy it and then it disappears, or it loses its patent?
Well, I've actually interviewed a number of inventors and even investor groups who have developed these technologies quite far down the path, and then suddenly they will either get a national security order where it will be seized, or there will be a front company that will buy up the technology and then put it on a black shelf. Because let's say that you're a very large oil company with $500 billion in capitalization, market cap, and a technology comes along that's going to threaten that. It's not difficult to imagine spending, a few tens of millions or even a couple $1 billion for it, because you're protecting a wealth base, an asset base of fossil fuels that are much greater. And this is normal. This is normal. You would think that people would protect their interests, and people do. The problem is there is this, when you hear some of the folks say there's this sort of rule by special interests that takes place in programs like this, they're quite correct. And so the way that this happens is not only by the technology being bought out and put on a black shelf, but often, unfortunately, and I have a man who's a PhD physicist who worked for the Patent Office. He worked in an office that looked for these sort of technologies and then would seize them under Section 180, 181 of the National Security Act and patent law that allows for a national security order seizure. And even if it doesn't go to patent, if they learn of it in advance, they can have a national security put on it, even in advance of it going through the patent process.
See, I think the public...
This is what the Federation of American Scientists were talking about. And it doesn't have to be something as advanced as an anti-gravity propulsion system. The example the Federation of American Scientists used was a very efficient solar cell in 1971 that would have been a threat to the cost of oil and coal, the price point for coal and gas, and it was seized under a national security order in 1971. Now, this is 45 years ago. So I think people have to understand that this is an abuse of power. It's being done by people without the consent of the Congress or the President or the people. But it is this whole thing, this whole deep national security state that runs amok. And there is a lot of collusion between the corporate world and these interests within the government to make sure that the apple cart isn't upset, though at least their apple cart. Of course, meanwhile, you have such enormous poverty around the world, which could be alleviated, so much lack of development around the world that they're trying to develop India, for example, right now, but they're doing it with coal-fired power plants, and that's why New Delhi is the most polluted city in the world now. So to solve these problems, you're not going to do it with smokestack industries from the 1800s, and this is what we're trying to point out to folks. This is a very real problem. It has very much less to do with fantasies about extraterrestrials from outer space, although certainly there's life out in outer space, than it does to do with the human condition and how we fix it here today, now.
I totally understand that, and I can only begin to imagine how the geopolitical situation of the entire world would change if we had access to this kind of technology. I want to just say that it's not just this using regulatory authorities to suppress this. There's a pattern of harassment and significant harm and even murder associated with this kind of suppression, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. There have been many people who affect people on my team have been. And, we had an inventor under contract to develop sort of an early version of what's called an Earth battery. It was a Tesla double-field system. And without going into gory detail, it basically would create a free energy source. And about the time he got underway, with any significance, a team of people came down and literally threatened him and his wife and family. And this just happened in 2010 or 11, so this is not ancient history. And I think this is something that you would think would be illegal to do, and I suppose it is, but to whom are you going to complain? And I think in most cases, if you get someone working at a university or a corporation or just a private inventor, they're not willing to take on those interests. And this is why we feel the public needs to be aware of this problem and create their own shield, level of protection for people who are trying to fix this problem.
Well, that's what
and that's really the main thing we're advocating, is that the public needs to gather together and support research and development in this area, but also create enough public awareness that it's safer for people to deal with it. Because one of the things I found with the Disclosure Project, we did a National Press Club event with over 20 military and top-secret witnesses in 2001, May of 2001, and eventually about 800 million people around the world saw this. Now, what's interesting is that you would think that people would have been threatened for doing it. These people who had national security oaths, none of them were, because there was so much public awareness and scrutiny of what we were doing. These folks were afraid to step into that spotlight. So one of the things I say to people who want to develop this sort of science and technology is that they cannot do it secretively. They have to do it in a way that's quite open, where the public is watching what's going on, in real time.
Is that what's protected you, Dr. Greer? So we have an entire strategy for how to get around this problem. Is that how you've been protected? Because I have wondered about your safety, actually. I've watched your career very closely since the Disclosure Project back in 2001, and I've thought that you were very brave, all things considered, and I wondered if you've been threatened and if you're worried.
We have been, but that look, it goes with the territory. And besides, I'm an emergency doctor and not someone waving crystals over somebody's head. And, I've had gang members come in with machine guns threatening my life. I'm not someone to back down because of this kind of stuff. But the other thing is that there are so many people, I have to say, in the public, but also people in high places who very much support what we're trying to do. They're not necessarily wanting to stick their own necks out, but they're quite aware. And this includes people in the intelligence community, at the Pentagon, and elsewhere, who are appalled that this secrecy has gone on this long. And let's just say they have my back in a very significant way. But it's a problem in terms of getting people who are, let's just say, ordinary scientists and inventors, or even people who are ordinary investors, to get involved with something, because the first time someone knocks at their door and is intimidating, they tend to run with their tail between their legs. And you've hit on something here that's very key. If people go through all the reasons why our world is in the condition it's in, and we don't have these sort of extraordinary technologies, I tell people it's because of the lack of courage to stand up to these bullies. And I think it's very important that we be willing to stand up to them, because let's face it, I mean, if my father's generation hadn't stood up to Adolf Hitler, we'd all be goose-stepping to Hitler's great-grandson right now.
Well, I appreciate
it. There's a need for courage, and you don't find that too much anymore. And it sounds quite old-fashioned and quaint, perhaps. But the rate-limiting issue here is having the courage to go forward, even though there may be some incredibly powerful and rather nasty elements who want to stop you. And I think that's what people have to come together to do, not alone, but as groups of people, as sort of a mass social movement.
Well, that's why I wanted to have you on my show, to be honest, because I wanted to help you spread your word to a different kind of audience. And I want to ask you on their behalf, what can they do?
Well, it really depends on what their capabilities are, but in terms of what everyone can do is raise awareness and learn about the issue themselves. We have so much information at our website, SeriousDisclosure.com, that's free. We have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/sdisclosure, S as in Sirius, the star system, Disclosure, that if you go there, there's just hundreds of hours of educational material, so people need to educate themselves. Then they need to help spread the word. Certainly we welcome people's contributions. There's a place to donate on our website, and also they can take action themselves personally on this and begin to organize people into efforts. And lastly, if there's anyone out there who has these sort of technologies that they've developed or know people who have, they need to network those to us. We have an entire strategic plan that's up on our website, quite transparent, of what we will do if there's someone who makes it through the national security net and can get one of these technologies to us, we will not respond to a national security order. We will take it public very, very quickly.
And you have the power to do that these days.
Yeah, no, I would defy a national security. In fact, Ted Koppel of ABC Nightline years ago asked me, he said, what will you do if you got one of these? I said I would simply defy it and hold a massive press conference and show the world what it is and put the blueprint out on the Internet.
Well, you raise an interesting
point. I tell people there's a lot of things people can do. It all depends on what their capabilities are. But it's something we need to come together as a society and take quite seriously, because the world isn't getting any more safe with the way we're living on it now, with the environment and the condition it's in, and also geopolitically, the way the world is going. And so many of the problems can be traced to the curse of oil, whether it's in the Middle East or other countries. And whether it's an environmental problem or geopolitical problem, so many of these problems trace to the curse of the black curse, as it's called, oil and fossil fuels.
One of the things that gives me hope, Dr. Greer, is that people have control of media in a much more real way than they did. And you have your YouTube channel, your Disclosure Project, the video that is on YouTube, the full 2 hours. I do advise people to watch it. It's an extraordinary video. Podcasts like this, we have some control in a way that we didn't even 10 years ago. And I think that does help, because the world is watching, isn't it? And it helps you get your message out in a very broad way.
That's right. And everyone can do it because of Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. You know, we did an event in Washington, D.C. that was an expose of this deep national security state in November. That video went viral, and a couple million people have seen it. Now, you know, MSNBC and even CNN would kill to have ratings like that on a show. So I think that we can do a lot that we couldn't have done 10 years ago, and that's where, you know, people becoming their own activists in their own networks becomes really a sort of a force multiplier through society. That's important, that to recognize that we have more power and control over communication systems now than we did certainly a decade ago.
Well, Dr. Greer, thank you so much for explaining that all to us so thoroughly and telling us what we can do. We're going to link to your website from the JillBlakeway.com website so people can find you and dig a little deeper. I do encourage people to dig a little deeper. This is a fascinating story, and nobody understands it more than Dr. Greer, in my opinion. So thank you so much for being on GCH and explaining to us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.